I saw a lot of like TED Talks and tech enthusiasts say like, oh, imagine what this technology, we could use it for. God, like we could revolutionize the medical field. This could be used for diagnosis. They have much higher rates than real doctors. Fast forward 10 years, what do we actually use generative adversarial networks for? Pretty much like getting kids addicted to TikTok. So it's like out of all the traits of humanity that have been attributed to ChatGPT specifically, I think the only one that is actually accurate is manipulative.
In my last video, I talked about the use of AI in science, focusing primarily on research, in academia, grad school, things like that, because that's really what I know, that's what I have experience with. And I think it was a pretty even-handed take on the topic. I guess time will tell. But I left out a pretty significant area of science, and that is science education. There's a whole path that one needs to take before they get to grad school and become a researcher or a scientist or whatever, and AI is having an arguably much larger impact on that path than any area of science. So let's talk about science education. It's not unusual for emotions to get a little high, to get emotional, not because of the technology itself specifically. After all, it is just math. Who would get mad at math? But because of all, the bullshit that surrounds it, the environmental impacts, the ethical concerns, the exploitations, the hype, the false marketing, etc., it is a messy situation.
This is the miracle of artificial intelligence.
I don't think you can really justify the ethics of it, but even so, I did try to give a nuanced criticism of the technology itself and perhaps some of what's surrounding it in my previous video, and also make sure to highlight, the obvious benefits and the obvious uses that this technology has in science. Now, I want to do the same with education, with science education, but I must confess I have a much harder time doing that. This is an interesting time to have this discussion. If my math is correct, it's been about 4 years since the release of ChatGPT, which means the students who go to college next fall, will be freshmen next fall, they will be the first generation of students who've had ChatGPT throughout their entire high school career, or whatever you call it. If you consider high school as sort of like the beginning of serious academic development, which is a reasonable assumption, I think, then this will be the first generation of students who have nothing else in their quote-unquote serious academic development. There's really no mystery on how this technology is being used in education, for the most part. To cheat, right? It's not that complicated, it's not that deep. There's no shortage of stories about teachers struggling to figure out how to deal with this unprecedented level of cheating that's happening as a result of LLMs, which kind of in turn gives them no choice but to use AI themselves to do the grading, leading to one big hallucinatory clusterfuck of made-up nonsense. That's not to say that cheating is new. It isn't. Cheating has been a thing since school has been a thing. There have been ways to cheat before, services that you can pay to write your papers for you, solutions to pretty much every textbook problem imaginable, things like that. However, it's never been as easy. The barrier has never been as low as it is now. To help me explore this topic a little bit further, because I'm certainly no expert in education, I talked to someone who knows about education and science education a lot more than I do.
Hi everybody, my name is Costanza. You might know me from a YouTube channel called The Strange Loop, where I talk about history of physics and philosophy of science. I'm here today to talk about LLMs, which are not exactly my field, but I do have a degree in physics education, a master's degree in physics education. And so I hopefully will be able to say something interesting at the intersection of LLMs, which are conquering the field of education at a breathtaking speed, and what teachers can do, what, is the role of those tools in education, if any, and stuff like that. So thank you very much for having me.
So I wanted to ask Costanza some question, but I'm also interested in your opinion. If you're watching this and you're a student or a teacher, or you know someone who's a student or a teacher, leave a comment with what's your experience been with education since the introduction of AI and LLMs. How has AI or how have LLMs affected your experience in education? Nothing exists in isolation, of course. Things tend to be interconnected, issues tend to be interconnected. And so in that spirit, many people will comment or may have already commented that LLMs are simply exposing already existing underlying problems in the educational system. And to that, I would say, yeah, sure, that's true, but it's also kind of besides the point. I'm not saying that there aren't problems in the educational system of, insert your favorite country here, but it's not that simple. There are many reasons within or even, in a perfect education system, there are many reasons why educators do the things that they do. And that's why there are legitimate concerns that are introduced by LLMs. While researching this video, I came across a lot of, Reddit posts, comments to articles, comments to YouTube videos, etc. I guess it is a hot topic. But so many comments complaining that, the education system has missed the point, or it's struggling because it's not teaching you critical thinking, and it's just teaching you to do X, Y, and Z, and X, Y, and Z, of course, are not considered valuable, etc., etc. Critical thinking is a term that everyone just kind of loves to throw around when discussing this topic. And the one quote that I kept seeing over and over again as I was kind of browsing through different posts and different articles about this was the following: when the measure becomes the target, it ceases to be a good measure. And to be honest, it kind of got annoying after a while.
I think this discussion is compounded in its difficulty by the fact that any discussion about the education system is mostly had by people who are really high in their emotions. Like maybe they have some baggage from school, which is very, very common and very, very legit. And like those feelings are very valid. But I feel like a lot of people because they never study how the education system works, which, they that's just literally not their job because they never want to go into teaching. They never take the time to kind of, first of all, to separate like what is actually the school's fault, what should have been the responsibility of the education system, what should have been the responsibility of their teachers, and what was just like an external circumstance that just was very unlucky that was happening in their life at their time. Because like if you were figuring out your sexuality in high school, you probably didn't have a great time, but that's not really the fault of your teachers. That's not something that like the government can do something about by acting on the education system and stuff like that. So there's this whole bunch of problems. Unfortunately, discussing the education system is always going to be compounded again in its difficulty by the fact that one, people's emotions really run high all the time, very legit, but kind of unfortunate when we want to have a productive discussion. And two, people don't know how the system works and what the system is trying to achieve. And people have not taken the time, because again, they do other work, like this is very legit, but they have not taken the time to understand what incentives the education system is trying to minimize and min-maxing for, if that can make any sense. Like teachers are always trying their best, and people who design curricula are trying their best in a nation that gets in a sovereign country. If you live in a Western country, then your country probably gets most of its resources and most of its like GDP and stuff like that by people with critical thinking skills. In Italy, like the main source of GDP is like heavy industry, like machinery and cars and stuff like that. That requires engineers. Like a country requires engineers, and good ones at that, to run. The country absolutely wants everybody to have critical thinking skills, to not be left behind by the system, to not develop a losing attitude towards curiosity. Like that is in everyone's interest. Thinking of the school system as a sort of like cabal or in conspiratorial ways is extremely counterproductive for this discussion to be had, but I also really, really understand why people do it. So that's kind of like an added layer that if you try to bring the discussion to, in any way, a public setting, the feedback you're going to get is from people who kind of have not worked through the fact that they feel like their teachers hated them. You know what I mean? And that's kind of like and you cannot really address it without being condescending in a way. So there's also that added difficulty.
One bad teacher can really ruin school for someone. As many people have pointed out, when it comes to the general usefulness of LLMs in science, it's complicated. I've already talked about that. You have to be cautious and judicious about sort of the kind of work that you're willing to delegate to these models. If you already know what you're doing, these tools can be genuinely helpful. You have to check it. Of course, you have to make sure the answer is right. And in things like coding, these are especially useful. It's kind of been pointed out that this is sort of the best case scenario for it. But you can certainly explore this ambiguity and find and maybe try to define where these tools are useful and when they are more of a hindrance than they are useful. I would argue that this question is much less complicated when it comes to the use of LLMs in education. If you ask ChatGPT for the answer to any homework problem, it most likely will give you the correct answer, almost certainly. You won't learn anything, and if you have to do those problems for an exam, you will fail. But if all you care about is acing that particular homework, LLMs are perfectly capable of doing that. It's hard to argue that they aren't. I mean, any problem that you ask is probably already in the training set. The entire internet was used to train these models, including illegal copies of every textbook ever written, probably, so that's not really a surprise. And when it comes to assigning homework, teachers don't really reinvent the wheel with every assignment. There's generally a finite pool of assignments, usually from textbooks, that teachers kind of take from, mostly for good reasons, and a lot of those have been kind of rendered useless by the introduction of LLMs. And it's not just conventional problem sets. If you need to write an essay or a report or a school paper of any kind, etc., ChatGPT will give you a pretty good facsimile of one. Personally, I find the writing produced by LLMs kind of bad, but I suppose for an overworked and underpaid teacher who has to grade tens or hundreds of these papers, it will probably pass.
Friends of mine who maybe graduated a few years ago but has started now working as teachers, maybe, they switched from either the academia or the tech industry into teaching jobs because they tend to be a little bit more cozy and less evil. And that's just what's going on. So I get this information kind of secondhand from conversations about my friends who are kind of with a similar backgrounds than mine. And also, people who started my major in physics education with me, but has since, they graduated much faster. And so they entered the workforce as teachers and now are seeing the consequences of it. So I want to say, two perspectives that can be useful. All of my friends are very concerned about this, and they try as hard as they can to come up with tricks and things to basically prohibit their students from using LLMs. So, for example, one thing that a friend of mine says, he teaches math and physics in high schools, and he's a substitute teacher now. So he sees a lot of classrooms. And one thing that he does is, for example, to when he writes the homework at the blackboard, he does a little drawing, and he says that helps because it makes LLMs have a harder time. I imagine there's gotta be time in which you can just upload a picture of your homework that you've written on your on paper, and you can just upload a picture of the paper to ChatGPT. I imagine that is going to be a little bit short-lived as a trick, but that's, for example, something that comes up. So I just wanted to say that teachers are extremely concerned about this. They do see the results of LLMs, at least for the anecdotal evidence that I have, and they're trying to come up with systems to work around this. It's just very difficult.
In our conversation, Costanza identified the process of test creation, that is sort of like the general way in which educators use to assess students, as a key element to learning that is particularly threatened by LLMs. This is not surprising. Tests are an area of education with possibly the most pressure attached to it, and sort of the one that ends up mattering at the end, and or maybe the one that students care the most about at the end. Even if we completely redesign the educational system from the ground up, it's hard to imagine a version where tests of some kind don't take part of it in some way, shape, or form. People tend to have an aversion to tests. They often find them artificial or an arbitrary credential. The phrase, "I'm just a bad test taker," is something that I heard a lot of students say when I was in college, after an exam or something like that. Of course, the implication being that the grade you got in the exam was not a true reflection of your knowledge. While perhaps there may be some truth to that, generally, there is no test that will be 100% an accurate reflection of the knowledge of the skill that they're supposed to be testing. That is a virtual impossibility.
In education, there's a fundamental problem, which is obviously unsolvable. That is, the teacher cannot read the student's mind. We cannot directly assess what exactly this person has understand, how the things work in their mind like that. The learning moment, the moment in which things click, is just going to happen inside their minds. This is, by the way, good. Everybody's sovereign on their own mind, and this is a good thing. If we ever...
For now. For now,
we should not invent mind reading and mind control. And if we ever invented, Lord forgive, we should definitely not deploy it on children and teenagers like that. No. But this obviously, like, limitation of the human mind in a way creates a necessity for tests, or at least for ways for the teacher to kind of gauge and try to guess what these students actually have learned, and if they have learned something wrong, kind of how to fix it in a way. And this is where, like, the subdiscipline of test creation comes from in education, and specifically in physics education, because physics is a subject that you learn only through exercises. Like, the theory of physics is actually not that important. It's important that you understand how to use it, right? And the thing is, there's always going to be some sort of gap between what we want the student to learn, like the concepts, the things that we want them to remember, the types of mental operations that we want them to do. There's always going to be a gap between this and the score on the test. And this is in part because the test can be badly done, in part because there is a fundamental, like, discrepancy between being able to solve a question and being able to think, because, like, thinking is such an abstract thing. And it can also be in part because the student is cheating. I think that the best way to understand LLMs as a threat to education is because they have the potential to, again, widen this gap.
If, the proper function of an educational system, or at least part of it, is to shrink this gap between the test and the skill that it is meant to represent, then the presence of LLMs only makes this gap wider, and thus rendering, the educational system itself relatively ineffective.
All the school can do really is to prepare you to pass the test. Like, that is kind of what it is designed to do. And a lot of it is creating the environment that incentivizes you to learn as much as possible by passing that test, and also test design and test, creation that create a big overlap between the skills that the students walk away with and what you need to learn to get a good mark. Because obviously not just the score on the test, but it's also like your behavior in class and your ability to cooperate with your classmates and stuff like that. But it's like you want as big of an overlap between those two. But there's always going to be, like, a pretty significant distance between those two. And also the distance is just going to vary wildly between professors and between students, especially because it's a very, like, we're trying to standardize something that is extremely individual and special to yourself and to your own personality and skill sets.
One approach that teachers have had to adopt with the rise of LLMs is to bring back more in-class assignment. Now, I suspect this is a general trend. In many science classes, in-class assignment probably never went away. That's still, I think, heavily featured in science education. The many areas of science education still rely on in-class exams, which would be hard, to use LLMs for. Still, there have been attempts in science education to create more project-based assessments with a take-home component, allowing students to think more about the subject. Perhaps, there might be a research component to allow the exploration of a topic at a deeper level. These type of assignments come with, a lot of benefits. They allow students to be more creative, more insightful. They remove the pressure of in-class exams, and arguably they are a more accurate reflection of the application of a certain skill in the real world. They're also very difficult to implement in the presence of LLMs, forcing teachers to rely less on them and back to more traditional in-class assignments. To quote an article from the New York Times that I found on this topic, "The shift to extemporaneous and oral performance means losing the ability to give students moderately complex goals that they have to wrestle with on their own. Timed assessments may benefit students who are good at thinking quickly, not students who are good at thinking deeply."
I don't want to imply that, like, the solution to this is to just give better homework or design better tests, but it feels to me like the biggest and most immediate threat is that LLMs create this absolutely complete discrepancy between what students can do and what students is learning and teaching themselves in their homework at home, and what their homework says to the teacher and what they score on the test and all of that. So it's like cheating on your test, but for everything, because you have it at home and you can apply it to homework, and also a lot more difficult to account for and to correct for the professor. I think that this is a useful framework for people to have this conversation. I don't have a solution to this, but at least I can give you, like, a good boundary for this conversation to happen, so that it doesn't, like, stray too far away into, like, what is the role of education, all of that. And it's like, well, that's a
Sure.
a
Yeah,
big
yeah,
ass
yeah, yeah, yeah. I
box. You know what I mean?
I understand. We can innovate. I'm sure there's a lot of room to innovate in regards to test design and in-class assessments and anything of that nature. But in many areas of learning, still have to rely on kind of tedious, repetitive work. You can't really learn math and physics or chemistry or anything similar to that without sitting down and spending hours solving problem after problem on your own. There's just simply no substitute for that.
Well, I would argue that that's exactly the point of school, like to make you learn the basics, to kind of force you in the years in which you are both your brain is growing still, like when you're a child and teenager. So you learn really, really fast, but at the same time, you do not have the mental capacity to focus on boring stuff for hours and hours on end, like out of your own volition, out of your own hard work and motivation is not going to get you there. That's what I meant. Because your prefrontal cortex, whatever, is not developed yet. And so school, in a way, and this is controversial kind of, because it could be improved in many ways, but school in a way does a quote unquote favor to teenagers, as in it kind of forces them to do the boring stuff when it's the fastest, so that then they can ideally do more.
Thinking about this topic, from a certain distance, because I'm not in school and I haven't been in school for a while, I do wonder how much modern internet culture has contributed, number one, to the development of these systems, and two, to sort of their enthusiastic adoption in some circles. Like I said, cheating has been around forever. That's not new. But since the, internet, the widespread adoption of the internet, not only has information become more available than ever, faster than ever, but with the rise of algorithmic feeds within the internet, information is more selectively than ever just force-fed to us by the bucket load. Instant gratification is not only preferable or desirable, but it's also the norm. Same with cheating. It used to be hard to cheat, but it's just becoming easier and easier and easier, with LLMs essentially being the culmination of our desire for that instant gratification of information. Not to get nostalgia pilled or whatever it is that the kids say nowadays, but it used to be that you needed to put in some work to obtain information in the first place. If you had, a stupid question about, the Roman Empire or something, maybe you had an argument with a friend at a bar, were Anthony and Cleopatra really lovers, or was that just a stupid movie from the 60s? If you had a question like that, you didn't get the answer right away. You kind of had to work to get an answer. You had to crack open a physical encyclopedia, which they used to be massive and expensive, if you remember those things.
Are you an encyclopedia salesman?
No, madam. I'm a burglar. I burgle people.
I think you're an encyclopedia salesman.
You had to go to the library. You had to ask an expert. You had to read through a book or skim it to get an answer. You couldn't just control F for the right words. Days or weeks could go by before you even got an answer in the first place. Now we're so spoiled that if you're searching for something, you're barely going to get past the first couple of search results on Google. Not even that anymore now, since I suspect people are going to barely go past the LLM summary that Google posts at the top of every search result. Forget going past the first page of Google search results. Has anybody ever done that? It's embarrassing. This is by no means a complete argument. It's more me kind of thinking out loud. But I don't think I'm the first to make this observation. I was recently reading the book Vita, Contemplativa, in praise of inactivity by German/South Korean philosopher Byung-Chul, and this passage from the book stood out. Inactivity is time-consuming. It requires a long whiling and intense contemplative lingering. In an era of rushing, in which everything is short-term, short of breath, and short-sighted, it is rare. Today, the consumerist form of life prevails everywhere. In this form of life, every need must be satisfied at once. We are impatient if we are told to wait for something to slowly ripen. All that matter are short-term effects and quick gains. Actions are reduced to reactions. Experiences are diluted and become events. Feelings are impoverished and become emotions or affects. We have no access to reality. Reality reveals itself onto contemplative attention. I would definitely not suggest that the pre-internet era was better. Not at all. Nostalgia is a lovely tonic, but it only takes you so far. I think people in general are more informed today than any pre-internet era, which is, I guess, a good thing. Well, actually, the one source that I found on this didn't say that people are more informed. It said that people feel more informed, but nonetheless, I think it's a reasonable assumption to make that people are more informed today. There are times where it certainly doesn't feel that way, but subjective perceptions are tricky to evaluate. I think it may be the case of the average being higher, but the extremes are also got more extreme, more far apart, making the whole thing very, very confusing. Still, I think there are unquestionable benefits to the internet and the wealth of information that it has given us, and specifically the ease of access to that information. Not everybody has the means to buy an encyclopedia or go to the library. In many ways, the internet has democratized information. At the same time, I do wonder if something was lost when the need to work hard for information also disappeared. Perhaps this contemplation that Han talks about. I don't know. A lot has been said about the decimation of our attention spans, and maybe this is also part of that phenomenon.
And social media too, because I would argue that those are the other two technologies that we're finally seeing as a challenge to the development, any way you want to use that word, of young people specifically. Everybody, of course, because boomers are getting brain rotted by Facebook at a rate that I didn't think was possible.
They're eating the dogs.
That's a whole other story. We don't have enough power over them to actually shield them from the consequences of that. So it's kind of like someone else's problem. But as an educator, I do see, like social media, and before that, the internet, and before that, I'm sure it was something else, like the radio. I'm sure people have had conversation about this.
That's
with
why I'm
TV.
skeptical
Like,
to make this a big
panic
deal.
about TV. Within the moral panic, there is a grain of truth, and the grain of truth is that these technologies are somewhat disruptive, and so we have to change something in the way that we train and we educate students, and we have to have courage but also political power to make those changes in a way that actually furthers humanity and is somewhat for the better. Another big thing that I see taken out, frankly, of these discussions is the role of things like unions, especially teachers unions, and regulation for these technologies. Like we can't, like this is a massive societal change, and it's only the damages are only going to be mitigated if we have some degree of societal organization and power. And you're not, like, nobody's gonna get out of this by hating teachers and hating teenagers and not understanding each other. And that's the very unfortunate part.
Can we get anything positive about LLMs in education? Maybe. In my opinion, there is no substitute for communal learning in a classroom with other students going through the same thing as you are, in a back and forth with a human teacher, etc., experiencing the process of learning together. Nor is there any substitute for working hard and studying. Maybe there's a better way to do it, but I haven't really seen it. And while LLMs can possibly supplement these modes of education, we'd have to be very cautious about integrating them into these types of curricula, as the temptation to just take shortcuts and use them as shortcuts would be too great. Like it or hate it, humans are sort of preconditioned to take the path of least resistance. Sure, you'll have those weirdos who take the stairs all the time, but most of us will take the elevator when available. There can be an argument in terms of the democratizing effect of LLMs on the basis that, a lot of these traditional modes of learning that I mentioned are not, available to everyone, not equally available to everyone, based on things like geography or socioeconomic status, things like that. You could argue that LLMs can have a positive impact in those situations. You could also argue that LLMs would only be masking the root causes of those problems rather than offering solutions, so it's never really that simple. In my research, I ran into this video by Michael Burns, a philosophy channel. I think he mostly talks about philosophy and politics in that channel. Great channel, you should check it out. A fellow bald guy, if I may say so myself. Although I think I have a better taste in hats, but that's besides the point. But anyway, in this video, he interviews Dr. Fatma, who's another well-known science YouTuber. In the video, she talks about how LLMs, or ChatGPT specifically perhaps, helped her in a legal battle against her landlord, and that ultimately prevented her from getting kicked out of her apartment. And it's very hard to argue against that type of usage, despite all the caveats which exist regarding the use of LLMs. I mean, you should watch the video; it's interesting. But you could make a similar argument or an argument along those lines in terms of usage of LLMs in education. Another example is the case of self-study. My guest Costanza made a recent video about that, which you should also watch. Self-study is another area where LLMs can arguably have a positive impact, without the pressure of school and deadlines and all that, with the only motivation being just learning. There is less temptation for abusing these LLMs. If you're solving a problem and there's something that you don't understand about the solution, an LLM can maybe help with that. Perhaps whatever book you're reading doesn't offer a great or straightforward explanation. So an LLM can maybe offer that instead. After all, it is trained from the entirety of the internet. Still, even in that case, you could argue that LLM is just a shortcut. You could argue that the process of trying to find an answer on your own and trying to understand whatever it is that you're confused about on your own, even though much slower, perhaps it will involve perusing multiple sources, or maybe talking to people, posting in forums, online or offline, having discussions, etc. That process, though slower, would teach you more than whatever straightforward answer that you would get from an LLM. Although, again, I don't want to discount the genuine use that LLMs might have in a case like this.
I am a little bit of two minds, because on one side, I am very passionate about self-study, and I hope that it shines through my content. And I love to try to empower people to teach themselves the subjects, not just like with the tools, like which textbook to buy and stuff like that, but also like with the psychological traps of having to set up basically an education system inside your mind and having to solve all of the problems that the education system tries to solve for its students, but like all for yourself and all of your own free will, right? And this is a very complex problem of self-study. I do want to say that, like, while I definitely think that LLMs can be very useful tools for self-study for adults, I do think that when your brain is still a little bit developing, I think that creates more intellectual laziness than it creates knowledge that will stay with you. Because the things that you learn in high school, like, I know that they seem very difficult at the time, but I would like to propose the idea that they're the basics. They're designed to be the basics. And there usually is a way, the reason why the school is designed that way. So I think that a teenager is probably a lot better off studying, like following what the teachers tells them to do and trying to do their best, at least in their favorite subjects, rather than like teaching themselves on their own with ChatGPT. It's demonstrably much faster to learn a subject if you learn it from a teacher and from an institution, because they hold you accountable in a lot of ways that it's difficult to do for yourself when you're trying to do it on your own. I don't know how much you're gonna include of this, but it's just something that I wanted to throw out there, is that I feel like a lot of the rhetoric, like what I'm, for lack of a better word, gonna call pro-tech rhetoric, like the techno-optimism that shines through from Silicon Valley.
And I think this is something like on the order of the discovery of electricity or the transistor, or something like that.
Which in part is necessitated by tech billionaires want even more money. Like a part of it is marketing, but a part of it is genuine optimism and genuine like software engineers thinking that their tools are very cool and want people to use them for good stuff. Like it's not all negative, it's not all a sham, it's not all a bubble. But like, I feel like a really important point in that rhetoric and in that techno optimism is that, technology could be used for a good thing. In 2017, 2019, medical GAMs were all the rage. Adversarial networks, I think they're called. It was a new type of training for they're not called LLMs, they're neural networks. That's the word. But one thing that, for example, I noticed is that I saw a lot of like TED Talks and tech enthusiasts say like, oh, imagine what this technology, we could use it for. God, like we could revolutionize the medical field. This could be used for diagnosis. They have much higher rates than real doctors. And that was all really exciting. Fast forward 10 years, what do we actually use generative adversarial networks for? Pretty much like getting kids addicted to TikTok. So it's like, if you have technology that could be used for extreme good fast forwards 5 to 10 years and it's used for arguably pretty bad stuff, then maybe you should not be the one in charge of that technology. Maybe you should not be the one in charge of the development of that technology. Like, yeah, ChatGPT can be a wonderful tool for self-study, but is it built for self-study, or is it that self-study is used as a justification for why it should exist when actually we're using it for things that are arguably much more damaging to society and much more damaging specifically to the education of young people?
You may have noticed that I am sitting backward on a chair, trying to look teacherly, not just any teacher, but a cool teacher. The kind that, lets you curse in class or talks to you about rock bands and shit. And that means that I can't just be all doom and gloom. I've got to talk about solutions, right? Unfortunately, I don't know that I've got any. And to be fair, nobody should be expecting solutions from a YouTube video. But I guess I can't let my pessimistic nature get the best of me, so I should at least try, right? As I mentioned earlier, in-class assignments are one, albeit an imperfect solution, which also only addresses part of the problem, I think. Regulation is another obvious answer, but then, what kind and how will that look like? Is it better to restrict the use of LLMs among students? How are you going to do that? How are you going to enforce that?
Whenever we discuss restriction of technology, we have to be very concrete and pragmatic about the ways in which we're going to restrict it. Because first and first, we don't want to, I don't know, let's say that we pass a law that you cannot log into ChatGPT if you're less than 18-year-olds. I would agree with that on principle, but how does the law get implemented? Does that mean that you have to upload a document to ChatGPT because now we've just given a bunch of very personal information to this company that we're not sure we can trust, or if it's I don't know, this is dystopian, but is the government going to place technology on our phones that doesn't allow us to go to ChatGPT? It has implications. So I am in favor of a ban. I just feel like that necessitates a further discussion about how that ban would be enforced, I feel, because there is no such thing as a law that exists in the vacuum. That, I feel, is much more my concern. But then you go into further discussions. I do want to stress that this is an urgent problem and that we are taking away, I think, precious years from minds that are impressionable and that will never get back. Like the elasticity of the mind and learning possibility that you have at 16 never comes back. So there is a certain urgency, I think, to the problem.
We can rethink education. Maybe we should. Perhaps this is an invitation to actually redesign and re-implement education in a different way that works in the modern world. Gradeless schools is something that I've seen come up recently and has been tried in some places. I'm still not entirely convinced. But again, even in cases like that, assessments or tests of some kind are always going to be necessary. And, that still poses the problem of, okay, how do you implement those types of assessments in a world where LLMs exist and are widely available? And, the alternative, I guess the opposite of that, to constantly police and monitor students through in-class assessments, I'm not sure that's healthy either. Assessments that allow students to be creative and express more complex ideas are a good thing, and we need to figure out a way to make those happen. There is an argument to be made about designing schools that don't feel like a chore, that students would want to learn whatever it is that they're learning. But I don't know, there is the practical side of it where a lot of learning involves tedious, repetitive tasks. You can't learn math without doing math problems. And I don't know that we can ever make that 100% desirable. So it's complicated, I guess.
All tests and all ways of testing knowledge are gonna lacking in some way, and it's very difficult to. It really, in a way, is kind of like choosing the best of worst word. It's the best among two kind of terrible answers a lot of the time. But that's not mean that we should strive for better systems. I also think that I can only speak for physics. I do not know about teaching the humanities, but for physics and math, it is definitely very, very important that you can do exercises on your own.
Yeah.
So I would say that like hours in which the school is open and students can like solve exercises on their own in the classroom, and maybe like it's like supervised study and the professor can like answer possible questions, that would be very useful. Of course, then it would become a matter of funding. Like, can the professors afford 2 hours every afternoon to do that, you know? It's so that then it becomes a problem of funding. But that's also something that I feel could go into the right direction. Solving exercises in class has always been a staple of physics education, and that's for a reason. Seeing things solved is a different exercise than ChatGPT. Sorry, it's a different exercise than solving them yourselves, and in a way, it's what ChatGPT does. So, like for example, one thing that could be useful, I'm thinking on the spot, could be like if the professor, you know, solves an exercise themselves and then calls someone to the blackboard to have them solve a similar exercise. And one strategy could be to pick someone that maybe is not as fluent in that subject as their classmates and show everybody that like, hey, look, seeing someone solve an exercise is not the same as knowing how to solve it yourself. Like prove to the class that like if you let ChatGPT do the work for you, you're not learning as much. That might be a thing. I'm really thinking on the spot. Obviously, that has drawbacks. You don't want to like weaponize the ignorance of the worst student you have in that way. Like that can have implications, you know. But that can be something that could be useful.
An alternative philosophy would be to embrace LLMs in education, which can take a variety of forms, like designing assignments that take LLM usage into account. But that's really tricky, especially in the lower levels of education, like middle school and high school, and just puts extra burden on the teachers. I'm not saying it can be done. I'm not an expert, so that needs to be said. I know, I'm not an expert, certainly not in education, and so I don't know what form that would take, but it's something that I guess could be explored. I don't really know. One of the more dystopian solutions that I've seen is to get rid of teachers altogether and just replace them with AI.
There's a high school in Austin, Texas, where AI reigns supreme.
So you've been learning from AI, and now you're building your own AI?
Yes. Textbooks are so last century.
Let us embrace AI and the new way of learning.
Assuming this isn't a scam of some kind. I've seen them boast, great test scores for their students and all that, but they also charge $75K a year. So I suspect that AI is not the secret sauce that makes this type of school work. Schools in that price range and the parents of the children who can afford them will always get high test scores. They always have great education available to them. That's never been an issue. Rich families will be fine no matter what educational models they adopt. That's just not really an issue. It's the rest of us that are kind of in trouble. I seriously hope they don't use this as kind of a proof of a successful model that push for wider adoption, especially when that wider adoption may very well involve government subsidies. That is truly dystopian.
I think that this vision of school fundamentally misses a lot of good things that school does for people, to the point where I almost would say that they miss the point of school, which is a very teacher thing to say. It's a very educator thing to say. One of the most important things that school does is that it forces you in your most developmental years. It forces you for many hours of your day to be in community with people that you did not choose, that are not your family. And right now, at least, it forces you to be away from a screen, or at least from an individual screen. And we already, I feel, have seen the dangers of having a custom-made reality, a custom-made worldview just for you in your pocket that you spend way too much time every day. I think that like we already are seeing the repercussions that has on a societal level, and they're not fun. Like, it is actually extremely distressing for a scientist like I fancy myself, and for an educator, and for someone who believes in the good of humanity. At least we try. It is very not good to see just how little we have in common when it comes to like what we think is true. We're already seeing the society, very negative in my opinion, societal repercussions of having a custom-made media diet. Why would we want to have the societal repercussions of having a custom-made fucking education system? Like, right now in the life of a young person, the things that they learn in school is pretty much the only piece of reality and the only piece of truth that they have in common with anyone who's not in their immediate like friends circle and already agrees with them and is already like their same socioeconomic whatever. It like they already live in such a bubble through no fault of their own, because like their media diet has been changed by the technology around them, and they don't like you want to take that away too. That seems like such a counterproductive. And in my opinion, like, yeah, maybe we could have like personal curricula, you know? The trend on the internet could become like a thing, in the sense that like you could have a digitally created, an AI created selection of things that you have to learn, and it could be like tailor-made to your strengths and weaknesses and stuff like that. And from the point of view of like the efficiency of learning, yes, I can see why that would be an improvement. But like memorizing facts and acquiring skills is not the only reason why school is good for you. It's also that like you have to be in community with others, and you have to do together the same thing every day for a long time, and there is value in that. So I feel like right now, it's I don't know, it just disturbs me profoundly when I get any idea about school that frames a school as anyway inefficient.
The last question that I have in my notes is, are you overall optimistic or pessimistic about the future of education in the era of LLMs, assuming that LLMs are here to stay, as it is most likely? I do think that there is a bubble. I do think that things will change, but I don't think LLMs will completely go away. So I guess, what is your overall take?
I agree with I agree with that they're here to stay. I am not particularly optimistic about the future of education, just because like right before LLMs were a thing, there already was so much that could be improved, and so many like probably better compromises between all the things that education has to compromise for, that I'm already and I was not seeing an improvement at the rate that I would have liked to see, despite the fact that again many teachers are working really hard on this. So I'm not optimistic about the future of education per se, but I am confident that with great work and with great thinking and with a lot of ingenuity, and hopefully as soon as we can, we will solve for the problem that, you know, students are cheating and therefore not learning because of ChatGPT. Because there have been many technologies, like the argument that this particular technology has rendered education, or like some parts of education, which then gets extrapolated to all of education, useless and antiquated and all that. That's a problem that we've had literally from the beginning of education. It's a problem that we will continue to have as technology advances. The problem of like keeping students motivated through technological changes and through the, you know, gaps in generational gaps between them and their teachers. This is a problem that we've always had. And I like to think that teachers have always teachers are nothing if not resilient, you know what I mean, and creative and inventive. And they've always done so much with so little. And I like to think that they're going to do the same, you know? It's not, I don't want people to walk away with the idea that this is not a huge problem, but I want them to fight. I want people to get what their role in this fight is, which is not to, you know, pontificate too much about the education system if they have not taken the time to learn how it works, which is really interesting, by the way. It's something that I think a lot of people will get value out of. But it's not that I feel the public, I think, can get behind teachers and advocate for maybe more funding and more research into this thing, and new like prototypical or like innovative ways of teaching, and like more, you know, on the field studies of physics education and like humanities educations and all of that, and like little programs where we can get what the problems of the students are, because like you have to research this stuff. You can't just gauge it from academia. So that's something that the public can really do if they want to help the education system, and if they trust that teachers are doing a good job and they're doing the best that they can, is advocate for more funding and advocate for people to take these problems seriously. And overall, I think that we can all do a lot more work to make teenagers and kids know that even if school is very flawed and very difficult in many ways, we're trying to make it better at any point, and we absolutely do not give up on them. We do not take their needs for granted. And there is no such thing as a trivial problem when it comes to education, and we're all working really hard to solve it.
I'm generally a pretty pessimistic person, but I don't want to end the video on a pessimistic note. So I'm glad my guest Costanza was able to be somewhat optimistic about the future of education. I know it's frustrating not to offer any concrete solutions or at least options, but sometimes it just helps to talk things through and contextualize them before you can deal with the problem. So hopefully this video scratched that itch a little bit. And with that, I would like to thank Costanza for sharing her thoughts and agreeing to talk with me about this topic. If you haven't already, please check her channel out, consider signing up for her Patreon and all that. And if you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to this one as well. It will make my day. All right, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I think I'm going to take a break from AI subjects for a while. Maybe I said that in the last video too, but I mean it for real. This time, I'm tired of talking about it. I'm tired of thinking about it. I've been thinking so much about AI that's been seeping into my dreams. And that's certainly not a good thing. All right, I'll see you on the next one.